Thanks very much, Andy. I always get slightly embarrassed with these gushing introductions. And good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this to speak here today. It's a privilege. Throughout my professional life, I've contributed to design standards and guidance, hence my interest in the topic. I'm grateful to Professor Grant Mills of University College London's Bartlett School for letting me rummage through what remains of the Maru library for this talk. During the talk, I'm going to question the value and the style of health design standards and guidance that we use today. So buckle up, it's going to be an interesting ride. Okay. So design standards, guides, planning procedures for health infrastructure common across the globe. These documents are increasingly prescriptive. You may recognize a few of these, determining the size of hospitals, the spatial organization, engineering systems, room layouts, and listing the equipment provided. This gives the client confidence in the procurement. It promises functionality, delivers equity across the system, and provides a robust compliance framework. On the other hand, it represses agility, contingency, and innovation necessary to deliver a class of buildings that's needed to accommodate shifting population needs, climate change, rapidly developing advances in artificial intelligence, health technologies, and digital communications. Design guidance didn't drop from a tree in its present state, but it's been evolving in a rather haphazard way and driven by changing circumstances into what we have now. Common themes of standardization are economy, improved clinical outcomes run through each generation of standards. Along the way, we've accumulated an edifice of documentation that is tried, tested, and, in my view, largely failed. In 2017, Architects for Health, of which I was chair, carried out a survey of its membership in the UK, polling the views on the standards and guidance used in the UK. The results were almost universally negative. I think it'd be very interesting to have the same sort of poll here across Australia and see what the view is from the audience and from the wider community here, because I do think we've got a problem. In my experience, there are problems with guidance and standards. They're increasingly difficult to manage. Those of you who've been involved in maintaining and managing standards will know this. You build this edifice and it becomes a problem. There's a tendency towards over-specific departmental rather than integrated planning. It's a focus on producing a fixed product rather than adaptable infrastructure for the dynamic system and the workforce, and they deter reasonable challenge. The development of a room-based guidance is like Lego. You can almost assemble a building from those standard rooms without having to ask serious questions. It's probably worse, yes. The way that we validate and publish guidance makes it too slow for a rapidly changing world. The lag between planning, funding approval, design, construction, and commissioning mean that instead of being ahead of the curve, our buildings are obsolete by the time that they're commissioned. So how did we get here? And is there a better way to brief and plan the future of health infrastructure? Okay, so nice picture of Paris for anybody who recognises this. So this is taken from the top of Notre Dame before it burned down. And the building you see in the centre of the image there is the Hôtel du Dieu. You can recognise Sacré-Cœur and Eiffel Tower and one or two other landmarks in there. So the application of science in hospital design emerged in pre-revolutionary France. The Hôtel du Dieu, the centre of Paris, dates from the Middle Ages. By the 18th century, the hospital had a bad reputation. It was overcrowded, had very high levels of cross-infection, high mortality rates, and was also ravaged by fire. Now, in 1787, the influential anatomist and surgeon Jacques René Tenon carried out an official study mission to England. Tenon visited 52 hospitals, prisons, and workhouses. He travelled around Europe and did site visits. And I keep maintaining that the way we're going to learn and change things is by doing those site visits ourselves. So in 1787, Tenon visited 52 hospitals, prisons, workhouses, collecting numerous statistics, detailed notes, and his report published set out the principles that underpin the modern public hospital. The sick patient had the right to speedy and efficient care, efficient healthcare delivery dictated by all aspects of the hospital organisation, location, architecture, staffing, design of rooms, beds, etc. Tenon envisioned a functional hospital as a healing machine, in his own words. He described the hospital as a quantifiable structure that was subject to management and evaluation. So in Britain, Florence Nightingale, who some of you may know about, introduced what we'd recognise as a modern approach to nursing. In 1854, she attended British troops engaged in the Crimean War and noted poor sanitation, high mortality. She appealed to the government, and she was extremely good she was, in her age, a really good influencer. She appealed to the government, presenting statistics on the debilitation of the army. She was a very good statistician and an early adopter of the pie chart to represent evidence clearly. Her advocacy led to the commissioning of a hospital whose design and management represented contemporary ideas of operation, efficiency and science in hygiene sanitation. Designed by the engineer Sir Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the 1,000-bed prefabricated hospital could be built in Britain, shipped out for speedy erection on a still-to-be-chosen site. The design took 6 days. It was complete, and the assembly at the selected site in Erenköy in modern Turkey took a further 5 months. So don't tell Infrastructure New South Wales. It was a modern hospital and credited with reducing mortality rates from 45% to around 2%. Gradually, the research work undertaken by individuals in Europe and America confirmed the belief that infection was spread in air, on objects, and in breath. The best antidote to these difficulties in the mid-Victorian, when I use the word Victorian, I don't mean Melbourne, right? In the mid-Victorian era, for the architect or professional nurse, was fresh air. And the ward plan endorsed by Florence Nightingale in Notes on Hospitals was designed as a long, narrow block, limited height, tall windows interspersed at regular intervals along each side with a window between each bed. These long wards could be laid out with a variety of ground plans and best regarded as oriented east-west, placed far enough apart to allow fresh air to circulate between the blocks, vitiated air to escape and sunlight to shine in. It is amazing how these were brought back into practice during the COVID era and proved to be quite effective during that. So we have from that the emergence of, I think, the first piece of real proper design guidance that we'd recognise, which is the pattern book hospital. So the pattern books were widely published around the world in magazines like The Builder, and the system became adopted around the world from the 1850s until about 1939. Dimension plans and specifications, finishes and schematic engineering systems were widely published and circulated. Hospitals based on this system were built in Europe, North and South America, the Middle East. I grew up next to one in West Africa. There are examples in Malaysia, Singapore, and of course Australia. The pattern book was amazingly effective as a method of promulgating hospital design standards and a system for building using a variety of construction methods. And there are plenty of examples of these still operating around the world, not least in central London. So I'm going to dive back off to the UK for a bit, because at the end of the Second World War, the rest of UK and the rest of Europe emerged exhausted and broke. There was no alternative but to rebuild, and a strong sense that the inherited social institutions must change. In 1946, the National Health Service came into being, inheriting a crumbling patchwork of hospitals, charitable buildings. There was a post-war building programme for schools and housing, but when the NHS assessed its need for buildings, there was no obvious template. The pattern book hospital no longer fitted the industrial scale that was envisaged or the leap forward in science, surgery and medicine, particularly antibiotics, that had taken place. So, two countries emerged from the war unscathed with hospitals that we could learn from: Sweden and the United States. So the image on the left-hand side there is the old Karolinska Hospital, and on the right we have a piece of Gordon Freeson's work. So Sweden had been migrating towards a national health system from the 1920s. Hospital architect John Weeks commented that post-war planners visiting Sweden were dazzled by the modernity of equipment and the elegance of design. In America, the Canadian engineer Gordon Freeson, his work embodied in the United Mine Workers Health Facilities, changed the way that we think about hospitals. Freeson redefined how hospital worked as a whole system. Circulation flows were structured, and new technologies brought to bear on healthcare buildings. He borrowed ideas from management and logistics and automation from many areas such as hotels, airlines, and factories, in his words, to bring the hospital facility into the 20th century. We owe a lot to Gordon Freeson. And I'll leap through this because, well, it's fascinating, but it's probably a subject of a PhD. So in the UK, the Nuffield Trust was established by a wealthy industrialist, documenting the state of hospitals, the operation of infrastructure, and they also commissioned a series of reports. Although over 60 years old, this 1955 report study provides exemplary comparative analysis of individual hospital departments, physical environments, capacity studies based on the demand for hospital services of a population of 400 to 500,000. The investigation team was led by Sir Richard Llewellyn-Davies, an architect, with a physician, a nurse, statistician, historian, and an accountant as part of a group of 30 individuals. The studies compared the overall area per bed, distribution of ancillary services, circulation areas. The measures are very sophisticated, appraising linear density, the scope for cross-infection and observation. Logistical systems were evaluated and staffing ratios compared both night and day operation. Clinical functional efficiency is evaluated by movement studies measured by observation and recorded using pins and thread. These highlighted the activity of nursing, patient interaction, travel distances, etc. Surprisingly, there was quite a lot of commentary on contemporary themes, such as the benefits and costs of single rooms, ergonomics, space around the patient bed for equipment and manual handling. The pattern book was no longer good enough for the district general hospital, and how the NHS should achieve an efficient and equitable healthcare estate. The new NHS hospital plan was conceived, and to deliver it, the Ministry of Health Chief Architect, William Tatton Brown, ex-army and a brilliant bureaucrat, set about building a group of architects and engineers to plan health infrastructure. New building standards were required, and his team set about developing them. Now, whether you're in the UK, here in Australia, Singapore, Canada, the US, or even Chile, the kind of health building planning guidance standards that we have today all seem to date back to about 1959. Today, over 60 years later, we've accumulated this repository of documentation, and looking around the world, standards of guidance for health infrastructure seem to have coalesced under three broad headings: descriptions of clinical practice and activity, engineering and environmental standards, and room layouts and equipment. Why is this the basis, and are we missing something? I'm going to map out a route and see what we lost. So I'm going to romp through this. So by the late 1980s, the UK government had developed a highly impressive suite of documentation. This is the kind of period when I started working. So it included activity database, activities, equipment, environmental and spatial data, CAPRICO, the capital investment approvals process, CONCODE, the contracting processes, design guides, design briefing system, ENCODE, which was energy, reduced energy and running costs, estate code, hospital estate planning and management, fire code, self-explanatory, health building notes, departmental design standards, capacity sizing and schedules, health technical memoranda, which is the engineering and assembly and component standards, and safety information bulletins. It was clear, comprehensive, and in the age of paper publishing, required a cohort of civil servants to manage and maintain it. We're going to dip into a few of these. So we've got general policy guidance. From time to time, issues arrive in health infrastructure, which have a broad impact. Some, such as pandemics, and others are more specific. And these are sort of cross-system pieces of guidance. More commonly, pieces of legislation, for example, aspects of human rights, employment law, changes in governance, health systems itself, or simply public sentiment influence these. So a few of these that come to mind are internationally or nationally mandated carbon targets is a current theme, general guidance on gender separation, privacy and dignity, protection of vulnerable children, young people, promotion of art in public spaces. I think these will carry on. I think that any health system will need guidance like this. Perhaps the most interesting piece of strands to emerge from these years of frenetic activity was the design briefing system. This was co-branded with an integral to a set of documents. And the objective was to help the design team identify user requirements in a logical and considered manner. DBS used a disciplined checklist approach. It ensured a logical sequence of decisions, no key matters were overlooked, emerging themes or variations from standards were captured, but there was a record of responsibilities for decisions, and it provided a framework for post-occupancy evaluation. I think this is worth revisiting. We have activity data. The focus on productivity from those post-war Nuffield studies and a wide acceptance of the value at the time of time and motion studies emerging from the US in the 1950s led to the selection of ergonomics as a firm basis for modern design. A large and largely paper-based ergonomic database was developed, comprising descriptions of activities, components required, space required to operate, including the desired minimum dimensions, and any critical anthropometric information. A significant change occurred in the late 1980s, which had unforeseen and far-reaching consequences. In the translation to the digital medium, it now started to include environmental data and place the activity in a room. Now the assessment of volume of clinical activities could be transferred more or less directly into a list of rooms. The process could be largely automated, and this promised to massively accelerate procurement. But there are two problems. Room per activity tends to overprovide accommodation, and it generates a high level of design specificity before the operational model of the hospital has been refined, and this problem is still with us today. So I just roll my paper over the side of the table. Associated with this, back one. Hospital equipment notes aligned to the HBNs were intended to focus the department or activity required and provide lists of medical equipment, describe procurement stages, and divided them up into groups so that you could have different procurements associated with different types of equipment. It's interesting that in the present context, because the preface notes that although related essentially to new buildings, the advice in equipment notes should be of value to those re-equipping hospitals, and we'll come back to that as being an important theme later on. Then we have technical engineering standards developed early in the process. Many in those days would have had their origins in military and maritime engineering, but nonetheless these have evolved rapidly with globalization of general and medical engineering equipment suppliers. There seems to be a convergence in this type of documentation around the world. However, as in all aspects of guidance and standards, they're slow to adapt to change and rapid digitization, sensors, Internet of Things, and controls. So there's a lag on that. We also had the wonderful components and assemblies data. So this is the next logical step in standardization of layouts of rooms is to develop a tested and dimensionally coordinated set of components. This was contentious at the time because it derived from a program of marking approved manufacturers. And you can imagine how that went down. Although this was well before BIM, it was in the era of overlay drafting. And this hierarchical approach was a big step towards properly integrated system buildings. And system buildings, of course, are one way of avoiding the necessity for a comprehensive suite of design standards, as the guidance is mandated in a chunkier approach, with the hospital worked up as a system building. This cuts out the detail and granularity of planning accommodation and activity on an activity by activity and room by room basis. In some ways, this approach is currently being considered in England with the glibly branded Hospital 2.0. As a large single provider system, the NHS has a long history of developing, then abandoning hospital systems. One type nucleus, which is what's shown there, was developed after the 1973 oil crisis, where the UK government found it couldn't fund all of the new hospitals it had promised. So instead, you would get the nucleus of a new hospital, a modular planning system. Unfortunately, this reinforced the medical departmental planning as the main component, undermining the approach to whole hospital thinking. So where do we go from here? When it comes to guidance and standards, there are plenty of pressures for more. Funders and procurement teams will always want more performance specification. It underpins ideas of value for money. Constructors manage design risk by a wide front of compliance, demonstrable fitness for purpose that the guidance gives. Planners, engineers, and architects treat a comprehensive set of health facility standards as a comfort blanket. It enables relatively inexperienced teams to be deployed. But as things stand, the type and volume of health facility standards tend to produce over-generous schedules of accommodation, which are then trimmed for affordability, insanely complex plans assembled from arrays of standard room types, equipment and infrastructure which is highly specified but builds in early obsolescence, and tight-fit plans which are inflexible and difficult to recycle. In my view, it's more sustainable and better to have less guidance and fewer standards. Spend a bit of time on this diagram. So I think my thesis is that a hospital isn't a product. It's more like a city. It has a number of stages. If we go through, and I'm going to just go slightly off mic for a minute, but the guidance may take a couple of years to develop. And then that, if you're lucky, that feeds into the planning process almost immediately. In reality, there's probably about a 4 or 5 year delay before it's picked up into that process. Then you've got design, 5 years for a hospital, maybe 4 if you're lucky. Construction, that's going to take 3 or 4 years. Commissioning a year or 2. By the time you get to the building being built, 70% of your assumptions at the stage of producing guidance and, in fact, design will have changed. So it's quite evident from post-occupancy studies of large hospitals that the commissioning process is largely a recalibration of a lot of those original decisions. And the other things that do have to bear in mind that go through the hospital life is that patient pathways are evolving, change, roughly on I think I've got those down as a sort of 12-year cycle. ICT systems are evolving very rapidly at the moment. So those are going to be changing on about a 7-year cycle. Medical equipment varies from type to type. Your substantial bits of medical equipment are going to cycle on about 14 years. Main engineering systems, your heating, your ventilation, your cooling, those are going to be, on a 15-year cycle, something like that. And then the building fabric, your floor finishes, your ironmongery, those are going to be about 15 years. So the major renewal cycles for a hospital, I suggest start at day one and really go round about 14, 15 years. You've got these major... Guidance isn't very good at. Guidance assumes at the moment that you're going to have a product on day one, which is going to be fine from the next 50 years. It isn't. It's going to change radically. And that isn't really built into the process. So a hospital isn't a product. It shouldn't be conceived as one. It's a complex organism with spaces, engineering and logistical systems, ICT, and human activities which interact and evolve at different speeds, as well as with health. Will have an impact on the local economy, employment, industry, education, transport systems. A modern hospital behaves more like a city quarter than an institution. The guidance tends to miss the wider impacts and opportunities and costs, the needs to provide different information at different stages to different groups. I think it misses the fundamentals, the whole system planning, the zonal organisation flows, the fundamental chassis that's necessary for a hospital. The realistic strategies, and again, we all do this, show us how you're going to grow and change, and we do some little dotted line that extends across the plan. But having realistic strategies to cater for evolution, growth and change. Cyclical maintenance, building in decant space. I mean, this is a fundamental effect. Mungo is going to talk about hospital typologies, but these things affect the shape of the building that you work in. So having sensible decant strategies, major equipment renewal strategies, so on, and strategies for embodied carbon adaptation and reuse. We should be considering guidance for shell and core separately from fit-out. Planners and designers should be better prepared to think further ahead, be more challenging to current assumptions. That's the nub of it. So, how do we go about it? So, always one for entertainment. Where is this leading? I think we're probably at the end of the current cycle of analogue guidance and standards. How do we respond and regulate the seed materials for the next generation of healthcare infrastructure? All major software companies seem to be banking their future on some form of artificial intelligence. We're only at the beginning of what can be gleaned from a few 100,000 Revit plans. This route, which is based on historic data, might be interesting, but I think useful outputs are a fair way off. Simulation modelling, on the other hand, has been with us for decades. It's complex and it's well suited to computer modelling of physics, processes and behaviours. This is a playground for the health building digital twin, and is, in my view, where we should be concentrating our efforts. Standards will still be there as constraints or parameters, but the ability of software to iterate, and to optimize against different scenarios through the lifetime of a facility will be a great step forward. The future is likely to be a combination of AI and simulation modelling. We'll need a lot of experienced human moderation, steering the schemes, not just through the initial delivery, but through the vast digital container life cycle of the physical setting. What we have isn't going to disappear. We may have plenty of work to move those standards into the brave new world, but there are still gaps. And there may be things that we've missed from that amazing explosion of systems and standards that came from the 1950s. The piece that I would like to see revived, and could sit alongside a lot of that simulation modelling, is the design briefing system. However good our guidance and standards and production tools, we still need to be responding to the right questions, and I'm not sure that we are at the moment. There's a lot of work to do, and for you and everyone associated with what the amazing project work that's going on in Australia, I think it's going to be an interesting next few years. So I'm going to wind up there, deal with questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. I will touch the section here about sense and that should be it.
Right.
Major phosphate removal programs would be rather have you heard with set station out more often than not they try and buy contractors that was trying to involve them or whether it's being by how do you see this military power that you
Right. Okay. I mean, I think this is fascinating. I mean, what contractors have very small margins and are very conscious about risk. They've been asked to take on an immense when designing a hospital. There's an immense amount of design risk that they take in there. The refuge for design risk is fitness for purpose. I'm sure is around compliance standards, conformance, and the ability to make sure the supply chain that feeds into that all have conformance targets. Now, in a paper-based system, that puts a huge demand on all of those feeding into a construction project, whether it's a component supplier, whether it's an architect or an engineer. We all have to demonstrate that we hit those compliance targets. I think the future is really moving towards a digital twin or a digital model that that enables us to demonstrate how this is going to work, rather than rigid compliance to a set of outdated standards that deliver something that plainly doesn't work at the end of the day. It doesn't work, but is compliant. A few years ago, I was looking at the idea of how this might work, and I got in touch with. I watched the film Lord of the Rings, and there were great battle scenes in Lord of the Rings with lots of sort of orcs and things all beating the hell out of each other. And the company that did that, company called Legion, realized that they couldn't animate all of this stuff. It was just too complicated. So what they did was they programmed all of these all these avatars to beat the shit out of each other. And I thought, looking at that, I thought, God, this is just like a hospital, really. And I do think that if we can sort of model the way that a hospital works, and then a contractor can feed into building that in 2 stages, because there is this, I've made the plea for shelling core and then treat the fit outs separately, and those could be separate contracts. But I think that demonstrating a successful operation through simulation modelling is a far safer place for a contractor to go ultimately than having a huge volume of digital compliance that, still, as anybody who's been around long in the industry knows, those you can trip up through those, So it's not comfortable for any of us.
questions? Before? We just want to write up, so we do not believe our staff have your one box.
Or battle scenes. Oh, come on.
Has also marked.
Spontaneous one. So if you were at work at CEO,
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
quick takes you minutes.
Yeah.
What would you do to solve the problem?
Okay. I mean, I think I've been very, I suppose, obliquely quite harsh on the procurement side of things, been driving the process. But you do need to have a strategic plan which pipelines work into the construction industry and so on. And that strategic plan needs to be reasonably long term. I mean, when I say reasonably, I don't mean 500 years, I mean 100 years. That sort of, you need to have an idea about where you're going for a fairly long period of time. And then you can start to pipeline into that with more and more detail. I think that there is a reluctance. It's very easy to say. I mean, in the UK, we've just had a prime minister say, "I'm going to build 40 new hospitals," which is crazy. It's a stupid thing to say. Well, what you do need to think about is how that system is working effectively. So I've talked about two-stage contracts. I think we need to put much more effort into those refurbishment cycles. And I think we need to recognise that a lot of the existing fabric, the embodied carbon in the existing fabric, whether it's admin blocks or that's reusable. I mean, there's a process called reverse health planning, which I quite like, where you instead of going to the fundamentals and saying, right, okay, we need this type of building, you say, well, we've got this type of building, what fits it quite well? And I think if I'm looking across the economy of New South Wales health estate, I think that there's a kind of intelligent view that you can look at, keep seeing how we can get best value of what we've got and then fill the gaps assuming that it's going to change and evolve fairly rapidly. But yeah, no, I'll take the job.
Any other questions from Claude?
Presentation, thanks. I'm interested upon there was a slide you got with the graph
Yeah.
showing we have about a 10-year time frame from I think and from
Yeah.
to operate.
If you're lucky, if you're very lucky.
So that I'm really interested in that because obviously we had a growing pressures to
Yeah.
compress that timeline. So I'm interested in your thoughts on whether you think that's possible, and if so, how?
You're right, okay. Well, one thing you can do is to have less of it, which helps you manage and speed up the process. I think looking at the moment that there is a lot of departmental type guidance out there, I think that a lot of that can be reduced and go far more for generic spaces. You know, these are the corridor widths. These are, you know, every project I've ever been on, they say, well, we're going to design this hospital. It's going to be 16 standard rooms, and you end up with 3,000. You know, you've got to be serious about standardization, recognizing that there's going to be a space hit in that. You're going to end up building more space, but you're going to save in revenue terms because you can adapt and change more easily. So have less guidance is a fairly good starting point, and you need to be pretty brave to do that. There'll be lots of people screaming at you for more. I think that obviously doing it all digital, which I think you're pretty much there, I think, these days. And then I'd like to see more planning for activity, you know, modeling, preliminary modeling tools, you know, so you can do it at a spreadsheet level. I'm sure all health planners will know what I'm talking about. But I think you've got to sort of, really be able to articulate how, 80% of peak capacity is going to work. And that should be available to everybody. You should know how close you are to that when you're doing your planning. And finally, I would sort of urge people to consider, rather than planning based on activity, planning on capacity. Now, that's planning in terms of, we know about this population, we know about the transport times and so on, the density of local population. Therefore, we know roughly how big it's going to be. And that activity will change. The schedule of accommodation will change, as it were, every 12 or 15 years. It just will. That's what happens. Go back to any hospital. It'll have changed. So don't fixate on the schedule of accommodation per department, if you can avoid that. This may be wildly unpopular advice.
Then just ask you up there, raise your hands and say that they're not.
Would be